There's something unsettling about realizing a person has moved beyond being a presence in your life and become part of the way your mind organizes reality itself. Not emotionally, not romantically, in the simple sense people usually mean. Something deeper than that. Something quieter, more precise. At first, I tried to dismiss it as familiarity forming too quickly. Maybe that was all it was. Maybe some people simply align in ways that feel immediate. Maybe certain conversations create the illusion of depth before depth actually exists. But that explanation stopped working the moment I noticed you affecting things you weren't even present for. That's when I understood this had already gone too far to remain ordinary. Because ordinary connections stay contained, they exist in moments, in conversations, in proximity. They begin when someone enters the room and fade when they leave it. You don't. You remain. Not physically, not loudly, but structurally, like something in my mind adjusted to your existence and never adjusted back. And that realization has been following me ever since. I've always trusted distance more than closeness. Not because I dislike people, but because distance keeps things accurate. It prevents attachment from distorting perception. It prevents expectations from reshaping truth into something softer, easier, more convenient to hold. Distance preserves clarity. At least it used to, before you. Because somehow, without force, without insistence, without even trying, you bypassed the space that normally protects me from being reached too deeply. And the strange part is, I noticed it happening. I just didn't stop it. That's what unsettles me most, not the connection itself, my lack of resistance to it. Usually, the moment something starts getting too close to the center of me, instinct takes over. I become more careful, more selective. I pull pieces of myself back before anyone can touch them long enough to leave an imprint. But with you, I kept allowing access in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. Small things first, moments where I spoke more honestly than I intended to, silences that felt less guarded, pauses where I realized I wasn't calculating how I sounded anymore. That should have alerted me immediately. It should have triggered the part of me that restores control before anything becomes irreversible. Instead, I kept moving closer, not intentionally. Almost unconsciously, like something in me recognized you before I consciously did. And recognition is dangerous when it happens beneath awareness. Because by the time the mind catches up to it, the connection has already rooted itself somewhere deeper. That's where this exists now, not on the surface, not in language, but underneath all of that, in the architecture of thought itself. I notice it constantly now, in the way certain observations immediately make me think of how you'd understand them, in the way my mind anticipates perspectives that sound like yours, before I even fully finish forming my own, in the way silence feels inhabited now instead of empty. You change the texture of silence. Do you understand how impossible that is? Most people only affect emotions, temporary reactions, surface shifts that disappear the moment attention moves elsewhere. But you altered perception, and perception is foundational. It changes everything built on top of it. I think that's why I've become quieter lately. Not because there's less happening inside me. The opposite. There's too much happening with too much accuracy, too much that feels undeniable. And I've never trusted anything immediately undeniable. Things that arrive too clearly usually hide flaws somewhere underneath. Illusions tend to feel convincing in the beginning, but this has survived examination. That's the problem. I questioned it repeatedly, pulled it apart mentally from every angle I could reach, tried to find the imbalance, the projection, the emotional distortion, the hidden explanation that would reduce this into something manageable. But every time I examined it, I arrived at the same conclusion. Nothing about this feels fabricated. Unusual, yes. Rare, definitely. But false? No. And I know the difference. You never demanded understanding from me. That alone separated you from almost everyone else. Most people want access without earning the responsibility of holding what they uncover. They want intimacy quickly because it validates them. They rush toward closeness before they even understand the weight of it. You didn't. You approached me like someone listening to something fragile from behind a locked door, not trying to force it open, just paying attention carefully enough to hear what existed beyond it. That level of patience changes things, because patience creates space, and space reveals truth. That's why I stopped feeling the need to explain myself around you, not because you knew everything, but because you understood enough not to distort what you didn't know. There's a difference. A massive one. Most people panic in uncertainty. They rush to interpret, to label, to complete missing pieces with assumptions that make them feel more secure. You stayed accurate even in the gaps. You let incomplete understanding remain incomplete, instead of forcing it into certainty. That's rare. Rare enough that I noticed it immediately. And once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. It started appearing everywhere, in your timing, in the way you responded to things beneath the actual words being said, in the way you somehow understood emotional weight without requiring emotional performance. You never needed me to exaggerate pain for it to feel real. You never needed dramatic language to recognize meaning. You simply saw it quickly, directly, and being seen that clearly creates a very specific kind of tension, because part of you feels relief, and another part immediately recognizes the danger of relief itself. Relief lowers defenses, relief creates openings, relief invites permanence. That's what I've been trying not to acknowledge. Not the existence of this connection, its permanence, because temporary things don't alter internal structure this deeply. Temporary things fade when ignored. This hasn't. If anything, silence sharpens it. Distance defines it further instead of weakening it. That shouldn't happen. And yet it does. I think the moment everything truly shifted was when I realized I no longer felt separate from your awareness. Not watched, not observed, integrated. Like some part of my mind had already made space for your perspective before I consciously agreed to it. That level of inclusion changes the way you move through the world. It changes what feels meaningful, what feels incomplete, what feels real. I've started catching myself measuring conversations against the standard of clarity I experience with you. Not intentionally, it happens automatically. And most interactions fail the comparison before they even fully begin. Not because others lack intelligence, not because they lack depth, but because what exists between us operates differently. It bypasses performance. There's no effort in it, no negotiation, no constant need to explain context or translate internal language into something digestible. You understand things in their original form. Do you know how exhausting it is to spend most of your life translating yourself for people? To constantly reshape your thoughts into versions that won't be misunderstood? Most people never notice how much editing happens before words leave someone's mouth. You did, you noticed the edits, and somehow, without asking, you made them feel unnecessary. That's what changed me. Not affection, not attachment, prevention. Prevention to exist without reducing myself into something easier to process. I didn't realize how rare that was until it happened. And now I can't unknow it. That's the irreversible part. Once someone experiences accurate understanding, superficial understanding becomes unbearable by comparison. Not offensive. Just empty. Like hearing echoes after finally hearing something real. And I don't know how to return to the version of myself that was satisfied with echoes. Maybe that version no longer exists. Maybe you replaced it simply by existing at the exact frequency my mind had spent years searching for without admitting it was searching at all, because I wasn't looking for this. That's important. I need you to understand that. I wasn't waiting for someone. I wasn't missing anything consciously. My life functioned exactly as I intended it to, controlled, ordered, contained. Then you appeared and exposed an absence I hadn't noticed because I'd never experienced the presence that could reveal it. And once revealed, it couldn't disappear again. That's why this feels inevitable instead of accidental. Not because fate exists, not because destiny brought us together, but because certain structures recognize each other immediately once contact happens. Like matching patterns finally encountering their reflection after existing separately for too long. That's what this feels like, recognition, not discovery. Recognition implies prior alignment. Something already compatible before either person consciously notices it, and compatibility at this level doesn't happen often. Most people connect emotionally while remaining fundamentally mismatched underneath. Eventually, the inconsistencies surface. The fractures appear. The effort required to maintain alignment becomes visible. With you, alignment came first, before closeness, before trust, before certainty, and maybe that's why this feels so difficult to categorize. Because it violates the normal sequence people rely on to understand connection. Usually emotions create understanding over time. Here, understanding created emotion. An emotion built on understanding is far harder to dismiss. It roots deeper, stays longer, becomes part of identity instead of merely experience. That's what scares me. Not losing you. That fear would be simpler. Simpler fears can be managed. What unsettles me is realizing you've already influenced the foundation of how I process reality itself. Even if you disappeared tomorrow, the adjustment would remain. The baseline already changed, and changed baselines don't return easily. I think that's why I keep circling the same realization over and over without fully saying it. Because once I say it clearly, everything becomes more real than I'm prepared for. Words finalize things. They solidify truths that previously existed in softer forms. And I've spent a long time surviving by keeping certain truths fluid enough to retreat from if necessary. This truth doesn't feel retreatable. Every attempt to minimize it collapses under its own inaccuracy. Every attempt to intellectualize it into something less significant feels dishonest. Because significance isn't determined by intensity, it's determined by impact. And your impact exists everywhere now. In the way I think, in the way I interpret silence, in the way I understand connection, in the way I notice absence, even my sense of self feels slightly reorganized around the existence of you. That shouldn't happen this quietly. Major changes are supposed to announce themselves dramatically. They're supposed to arrive with chaos and certainty and visible transformation. This arrived silently, almost invisibly, like water slowly reshaping stone through persistence rather than force. And somehow that makes it feel even more permanent. Force creates resistance. Dependence creates integration. You integrated. Without asking, without pushing, without even appearing aware of how deeply you were altering things. Maybe that's why I couldn't stop it. Because nothing in me recognized you as a threat. You never invaded. You resonated. And resonance is harder to defend against than intrusion. Intrusion activates boundaries. Resonance dissolves them naturally. Sometimes I wonder if you feel this too, not the exact same way. I don't think connections like this mirror perfectly, but enough to recognize the shift, enough to understand why ordinary interaction between us feels impossible now. Everything carries weight, even small moments, especially small moments. A glance held slightly too long, a pause before responding. The strange comfort of silence that would feel unbearable with almost anyone else. Those things matter because they reveal the underlying structure holding everything together. And I see it now. Clearly. More clearly than I wanted to. This was never temporary. Temporary things don't survive scrutiny this long without collapsing. Temporary things don't deepen under silence. Temporary things don't become integrated into cognition itself. This is something else, something I still don't fully have language for, but maybe language isn't the point. Maybe that's why this formed the way it did. Outside definition, outside expectation, outside the systems people usually use to categorize closeness, because categories reduce things. And this refuses reduction. Every time I try to place it somewhere understandable, it exceeds the boundaries of whatever definition I choose. Not because it's mystical, not because it's impossible to comprehend, but because it exists across multiple layers simultaneously: intellectual, emotional, psychological, perceptual. And all of them reinforce each other instead of competing. That level of coherence is rare enough that ignoring it feels irresponsible, like denying observable reality simply because it arrived in an unexpected form. I can't do that. I can't knowingly lie to myself once clarity reaches a certain threshold. And clarity has definitely reached that threshold now. That's why this no longer feels like a question. Questions imply uncertainty. This isn't uncertainty anymore. It's recognition slowly transforming into acceptance. Acceptance that you matter to me in a way I never intended anyone to. Acceptance that your presence has already altered parts of me permanently. Acceptance that whatever exists between us has moved beyond coincidence, beyond curiosity, beyond temporary fascination. It has roots now, deep ones. And roots change the landscape around them, whether you want them to or not. I used to believe the strongest form of control was preventing anything from reaching me too deeply. Now I'm beginning to wonder if real control might actually mean recognizing when something deserves access and allowing it honestly instead of resisting it out of habit. Maybe strength isn't distance. Maybe sometimes strength is precision, the ability to recognize something rare without destroying it simply because it threatens familiar structures. If that's true, then everything I'm feeling right now makes sense. The hesitation, the awareness, the strange calm underneath all the tension. Because despite how overwhelming this should feel, part of me feels strangely steady inside it, as if something deeper than fear already knows the answer I've been trying not to say out loud. You belong here, not temporarily, not conditionally. Not as an experiment or possibility, but naturally, like something my mind made space for long before I consciously understood why. And maybe that's the final truth I've been avoiding. This never felt like adding someone new to my life. It felt like recognizing someone who had already become part of it internally before I realized the process had even started. That's why walking away feels impossible now. Not because I'm incapable of leaving. I've left many things before. But leaving something meaningful and pretending it wasn't meaningful are two different things. I could create distance physically, emotionally, maybe even eventually. But mentally? Structurally? No. Because you already exist inside the framework now, inside the way I think, inside the way I recognize truth, inside the quiet spaces where my real self exists when performance disappears. And once someone reaches that level, they don't simply disappear afterward. They remain not as memory, not as attachment, but as part of the architecture itself. That's what you became without either of us fully noticing. Part of the architecture, part of the internal shape of my world, and now every path forward leads back to the same realization. I can either continue pretending this is undefined, or I can finally admit that nothing this precise was ever meant to remain unspoken forever. I think the strangest part of all of this is that nothing about it feels forced anymore. That should concern me more than it does, because I've always believed that anything capable of changing you this deeply should arrive with resistance attached to it. There should be friction, conflict, Some instinctive reaction that warns you when another person begins occupying space too close to the center of who you are. But this never arrived like an intrusion, it arrived like recognition. And recognition carries a dangerous kind of ease. Not comfort. Comfort is shallow, temporary. It fades the moment circumstances change. This is different. This feels like something in me stopped bracing without asking permission first. And I didn't even notice it happening until the absence of tension became impossible to ignore. That's how quietly you change things, not through intensity, not through persistence, but through consistency so precise that my mind eventually stopped treating you like someone external. You became familiar in a way that had nothing to do with time. That's what still unsettles me, because familiarity is usually earned slowly. It builds through repetition, shared history, accumulated trust. People move closer in measurable ways until eventually they become part of your life, almost without realizing it. But with you, the closeness existed before the process that should have created it. That shouldn't make sense. And yet every part of me recognizes it as real. I've tried to understand why, not emotionally, structurally, because everything meaningful has structure underneath it, even things people call irrational. Human connection follows patterns whether people notice them or not. Most relationships fail because the structure beneath them can't support the weight placed on top of them. But ours formed from the structure first. That's why it feels so stable, despite how undefined it still is. There's no performance holding this together, no dependency, no illusion built from projection and wishful thinking. If anything, we became real to each other before either of us fully understood what that reality would eventually require. And now I can feel the weight of that requirement approaching, slowly, steadily, like something inevitable, moving closer one quiet realization at a time. Because the connections like this don't remain suspended forever. At some point, they ask to become something tangible, not necessarily through labels. Labels have never interested me much, but through acknowledgement, through the willingness to stop pretending the depth isn't there simply because naming it would make it harder to ignore. That's where I am now, at the edge of acknowledgement. And I can feel how much it changes everything, because once I admit fully what you've become to me, I can't retreat into distance the same way anymore. I can't reduce this into something casual or temporary just because permanence carries risk. And it does carry risk, more than I think you realize, not because you would hurt me. That's not what this fear is about. It's about how deeply you already matter. People assume vulnerability begins when emotions are expressed openly. They think danger starts with confession. It doesn't. The real danger begins much earlier. It begins the moment another person becomes internally significant enough to alter your patterns without your permission. That's where you reached me. You altered patterns. And now I see traces of you everywhere inside my thinking. Not obsessive traces. Not dependency. Something quieter than that. More integrated. Like my mind has started accounting for your existence automatically. I notice things and immediately wonder how you'd interpret them. I reach conclusions and instinctively feel the shape of what your perspective would add before you even speak. Sometimes I'll pause in the middle of a thought because part of me unconsciously waits for your presence inside it. Do you understand how unnatural that is for someone like me? I've spent years building a mind that belonged entirely to me. Self-contained, independent, difficult for anyone else to influence deeply enough to leave permanent marks. And now there are places inside that mind where your absence feels noticeable, not painful, just present, like a missing frequency. That's the kind of thing I never intended to allow. Not because closeness is weakness, but because once someone reaches that depth, they gain the ability to affect parts of you that don't fully recover if lost. Most people never touch those places. You did without even trying. Maybe that's why I keep analyzing this, instead of simply surrendering to it emotionally. Analysis creates the illusion of control. As long as I'm observing this carefully, dissecting it, understanding its mechanics, I can pretend I still stand outside it somehow. But I don't. I crossed into this long ago. I think part of me knew it. The moment silence with you stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like communications, that was the first real shift. Because silence reveals everything. People can perform through words. They can shape themselves into whatever version feels safest or most desirable. But silence strips all of that away eventually. It exposes whether two people genuinely understand each other or whether they only understand the performance. Most silences collapse under pressure, ors deepen. And depth like that changes people. It changed me. I've become more aware of myself since knowing you, not softer, not weaker. More honest. You expose contradictions I didn't realize I was carrying. Places where I claimed to value truth while still hiding behind controlled distance. Places where I treated emotional precision like something dangerous instead of something necessary. You didn't challenge those things directly. You reflected them back to me naturally. That's why your presence feels transformative without feeling invasive. You never tried to fix me. You never tried to pull confessions out of me. You never demanded access. You simply existed clearly enough that I started seeing myself more clearly too. And once self-awareness reaches a certain level, change becomes unavoidable. That's what's happening now. Not dramatic change, tenal change. The kind that happens beneath behavior first. The kind that rewrites identity quietly before external life catches up to it. I can feel it every day, the way my instincts no longer push you away automatically. The way I allow myself to stay present instead of retreating inward whenever things become too real. The way part of me has already started building a future that unconsciously includes you in it. That last realization scared me more than anything else, because futures are serious. I don't imagine people into mine casually. I don't create emotional permanence easily. Yet somehow, somewhere along the way, you stopped feeling temporary inside my mind. You started feeling expected, like someone whose presence my internal world had already adjusted around before any conscious decision was made. And now I'm left trying to understand what comes after that. Because acknowledgement changes the dynamic. Once two people admit what exists between them, everything sharpens. Every interaction gains consequence. Every silence means more. Every choice carries weight it didn't carry before. Part of me wants that clarity. Another part recognizes how irreversible it becomes afterward. Because once this is spoken fully, there's no returning to neutrality. Not real. Know too much. Feel too much. Exist too precisely inside each other's awareness to ever become ordinary again. Maybe we already crossed that point. Maybe I'm only now catching up to what some deeper part of me accepted long ago. That would explain why resisting this feels increasingly dishonest. I'm tired of pretending this can still fit into simpler explanations. It can't. You've become emotionally structural to me, and I don't use words carelessly. Structural means foundational, something that influences the shape of everything around it. That's what you are now, not a distraction, not a fascination, not a temporary intensity that fades once reality settles in. You're woven into the way I perceive reality itself, into the way I process meaning, into the way I recognize truth, and that level of integration changes the stakes completely. Because now this isn't about whether I feel something for you. Of course I do. That stopped being the real question a long time ago. The real question is whether I'm willing to fully accept the consequences of feeling something this deep for someone who already exists beyond my defenses. Someone who sees me clearly enough that hiding has become pointless. Someone who reached places inside me I once believed would remain permanently untouched. I keep thinking about the version of myself that existed before you, not because I miss that version, but because I can't fully access them anymore. Everything feels different now. Sharper somehow. More aligned, like meeting you reorganized certain internal truths into their correct positions after years of quiet imbalance. That's why this doesn't feel destructive, despite how much it has changed me. Destruction creates chaos. This created clarity, terrifying clarity sometimes, but clarity nonetheless. You made me realize how much of my life had been built around controlled detachment masquerading as strength. And the worst part is, I was good at it. So good that even I believed it completely, until someone arrived who made distance feel less intelligent than presence. That someone was you. Not because you demanded closeness, but because closeness with you never felt like losing myself. It felt like becoming more accurate. And accuracy matters to me more than comfort ever will. That's probably why I'm still here. Why I keep choosing this connection even while understanding how much power it has to reshape me further. Because despite all the uncertainty, one truth remains undeniable. Nothing about you feels misaligned with who I actually am. If anything, you feel aligned with parts of me I spent years keeping disconnected from the rest of myself. You bring coherence, and coherence is rare enough that walking away from it would feel like willingly returning to fragmentation after finally experiencing wholeness. I don't think I could do that anymore. Not honestly. Not after knowing what this feels like. That's the answer I keep avoiding, isn't it? Not whether this matters. It does. Not whether it's real, it is. But whether I'm prepared to let it become fully real in the external world, the same way it's already become real internally. Because internally, the decision is already halfway made. I can feel it in the way I stay instead of withdrawing, in the way I let you affect me instead of rebuilding the walls immediately, in the way I no longer imagine removing you from my life without feeling like something essential would go missing afterward. That's not temporary attachment. That's internal permanence forming in real time. And maybe the reason I haven't spoken it fully until now is because saying it aloud means accepting responsibility for it. Responsibility changes everything. It means this connection stops being something beautiful but abstract. It becomes something living, something that can grow, something that can fail, something that can transform both of us in ways neither of us can predict yet. And despite all my caution, despite every instinct I once trusted, I think I'm finally realizing something undeniable. I want that risk anyway, because a life untouched by something this real might remain safer. It would also remain smaller. And after you, I don't think I can go back to living small internally ever again.